Well, Don, I remember one of the key things you told me when I first started was you could build just about any woodworking project with three major things: a table saw, a drill press, and one other thing.
And a router table. So years ago, decades ago, I built my first router table. It was pretty simple, just a piece of plywood, mounted the router up underneath it, and then I just used a 2x4 for a fence back then. Well, over the years, you want to add a few more features, and so we designed now this new router table.
Now, this router table has a lot of things going for it. Of course, like any router table, there's a top, but the key to holding up the top is what's underneath. And in this case, we built a heavy-duty cabinet out of MDF, created a lot of storage compartments to store just about anything you'll need for your routing operations.
Well, anytime you build a cabinet out of MDF, it's going to be heavy. Now, that's a good thing for the router table because you want that heaviness, all that weight, will absorb most of the vibration that you get with the router while you're routing, and it also tends to dampen some of the sound, the high-pitched sound from the router. So that's a good thing. Well, once you have the base built, now you can add on the router table top.
And there's a lot going on with this top. In this case, we built it out of 3 layers of plywood. Makes it a heavy-duty top, and there's a reason for that, which we'll see in a little bit. Now, a key thing is we put an insert into this table. That means you can mount your router, makes it easy to adjust and get in and out. Here at the front, there's a combination track. You can put a miter gauge in the slot up front, and then if you want to attach accessories like feather boards, there's a T-track along the back edge.
And then one more feature on the basic router table, and that is a fence. So we made a pretty heavy-duty fence, fully adjustable, dust collection on the back. So it works pretty well as a router table, but we couldn't stop there. In this case, we wanted to add one other feature.
And we made this a top. Instead of it being fixed, it's adjustable. Just loosen the knobs on the sides, and you can flip the top up into a vertical position.
So now the table is vertical, which means the router is horizontal, which means you can do routing in that horizontal position, but of course to support the workpiece, now we need to add on a table to support the workpiece.
Happen to have the horizontal table right here. Swing this in. There we go.
Okay, so you can see that this is a pretty heavy-duty construction for this table underneath and a heavy-duty top again. And it's all mounted with these pretty massive knobs that mount this to the regular tabletop. So let's get it off of here, and then we'll start to mount it. The knobs just fit in holes underneath here.
Snug them up tight.
So now we have a table mounted in the horizontal position with the router horizontal, so you can do all kinds of the horizontal routing operations.
Of course, you need to be able to adjust the table in relation to the bit. And we made that easy with this heavy-duty adjustment knob here underneath. You can turn it up or down to position things, and then lock the table in when you have it in the position you want.
So one of the things that's kind of common with this horizontal routing is to use these big raised panel bits. You've probably seen these massive bits. So it's good for doing raised panels, but it's kind of difficult when the router table is flat. You have to mount a big fence or something, hold a big panel vertically. Now you can just rest it horizontally. This bit would be buried down in here as you can adjust the height of the table, and you can bury the bit and make raised panels on this table now.
Well, what you see we have installed now is a straight bit. Now, I use straight bits a lot, especially for making mortises. So for this table, we have an accessory that comes in very handy, and it is a mortising jig. Now you can see it fits into the miter track here, slides back and forth for the length of the mortise, slides in and out for the depth of the mortise. But what's key is you want accuracy. So there's some stops that fit into the T-track portion of the track here. You can lock those in. So I'll start at one end, route in until it touches the table, route to the length of my mortise, bring it back out. What you end up with is an accurate mortise, whether you're doing 1 or 20.
So pretty cool to take a basic router table that started out years ago as just a piece of plywood with a 2x4 on it for a fence. Now it does all these things. So it's kind of 3 tables in one. You have the horizontal table in the normal position with a fence. You can turn it to the vertical so you can add now another horizontal table for horizontal routing, and then finally add on this mortising jig on that table. So it's a pretty cool table, a lot of work to get it done, so let's get started. We'll get in the shop and we'll start with the base. The first thing you might notice about our router table is that it's a massive project. Now by mass, I mean actually weight, and that's a good thing in this particular project. You can see how thick the tabletop is, actually 3 layers of plywood. Well, all that weight adds a lot of stability to the project. And to support all the weight for the top, you need an equally massive, heavy cabinet on the bottom. Now to make this cabinet, we decided to use a product called MDF. It's a manufactured sheet good, relatively inexpensive, but it's heavy and it's easy to use and it's pretty cheap, and as you can see, it's easy to paint. So we built the whole cabinet and the pedestal down at the bottom out of MDF. Now as I open up the doors here, you can see that the cabinet has some shelves, dividers up here at the top. These outside compartments are for the mechanism that allows you to tilt the table into the vertical position. So in order to support all this weight, especially when we put it in a vertical position, we added the cabinet, but we made this pedestal down at the bottom out of 2 layers of MDF. Gives it much more weight. The other thing that you might notice is that it extends out from the front of the cabinet. It's about 7 inches. So when the tabletop is in the vertical position, we add stability down at the bottom so this thing doesn't move around on you. Well, one of the advantages to making your own shop-built router table is adding all this weight. So you have the weight of the tabletop, 3 layers of plywood, the weight of all this MDF in your cabinet, and the pedestal down at the bottom. Now, this actually works to your advantage because manufacturers typically don't like to add weight to a project. It just adds to their shipping cost. But in this case, with all this weight, it adds stability, but it also cuts down on vibration. When you turn on the router and you start working on the router table, you have a nice firm base to work on, doesn't dance around the shop on you, and it cuts down on that vibration. Let's get started on this project by building the pedestal down at the bottom. Now as you can see, this is 2 fairly good sized pieces of MDF. The 2 pieces are glued together. So right away we start out with a problem is how do we glue 2 pieces this big together? It's relatively easy to get glue around the outside edges, and then we can add clamps to the outside edges. The problem is getting clamping pressure at the center of this. So there's a couple of ways to go about that. One is to use contact cement. Now you can either get the kind that you just roll it on, or I like to use this spray contact cement. But either way, you apply the contact cement to both surfaces, then you lower one down on the other, and it sticks together as soon as contact is made. If you don't want to go through this is a little bit expensive to use contact cement, and if you don't want to go through that expense, or if you don't like the odor that some contact cement creates, then you can just switch over and use good old woodworker's glue. Now in this case, we would spread the glue and we go back to the same problem, that is we can get clamps around the outside edges, but we can't clamp in the center. One solution to that is to use what's called a clamping caul. Now this is just a piece of 2x4 that's cut down and it's been slightly tapered on both ends, and that means that when we clamp it down, this will apply pressure right in the center of this clamping caul, which is the center of the 2 pieces that we want to get glued together. Now for pieces this big, we would need a pair of cauls, one for the top, one for the bottom, and we probably need 4 or 5 pairs of cauls to clamp this whole thing together. Sort of a lot of work, and as you know, I'm opposed to a lot of work, so there's an easier, much less expensive way to go about this, and that is to drill a series of pilot holes, and those pilot holes will hold simple wood screws, and the screws will hold everything together while we clamp it. So the basic process here is to drill a series of pilot holes. These are all about 6 inches apart, all across the surface of the pieces for the pedestal. We'll apply glue, and then we'll screw these pieces together, and the screws will hold it together while the glue dries, and they can just remain in there, and then later we'll trim this to final size. So let me finish up on drilling all of these pilot holes for the screws. I've finished drilling all of these pilot holes, get all the dust off of here. So now I'm ready to glue these pieces together. And the first step there is to separate the 2 pieces. And now I can start adding glue to the bottom piece here. Now as I add the glue, I just want to make sure that I get enough out on the edges, and I'll squiggle some on, a technical term. So I'll get enough glue out on the edges here, and right now I'm just going to do 2 edges. Now I want to get that spread around just a little bit, so I'm going to use a spreader, a notch spreader, sort of a trowel, and get that going here out on the edges. The thing is to try and get the glue out to the edge. It doesn't have to be perfect, because this glue, as soon as the 2 pieces go together, that glue will start spreading. So I'm getting enough glue spread around out to the edge so I have good adhesion between these 2 pieces. Okay, now I can do the other 2 edges, but I'm going to do the center here right now. And now I can spread some glue and do big squiggles. So the key thing here is that I don't need 100% coverage on the center. I just need some coverage. That's probably not enough, so it's easy to just add on a little bit more glue in here and do it sort of like finger painting or something. So I can get the glue spread around so I can get adhesion in the center of this. Add a little bit more glue, just in areas where I think it's a little light. Spread that. And then finally, I'm going to finish up on these final 2 edges here. And again, spreading it out, getting it out toward the edge of the MDF. Finishing up here. Okay, I've got enough glue on here, particularly out at the edges, that I'm good. Now I just lower this top piece, get it aligned on here, and start to lower it. And they have to be pretty well aligned so those screw holes match up the pilot holes. And now I can start screwing these 2 pieces together. Now in this case, I'll start in the center. There's 4 holes here, and I'll start with them so I have the glue spreading from the center out in all directions. So I've got these first 4 done, and now there's a couple more on each side, and I'll do those. And then finally, I'll start working around the outside edges here. So with all of the screws now fastened down, these two pieces are permanently joined together. Really all we have to do at this point is let the glue dry, and then we're ready to come back and we can trim up the edges to the final size. I just completed trimming up the 4 edges of the pedestal base. That gets them nice and smooth and also square, and trimmed down to final size. Now, the base could be used just like this, but it's going to be on a shop floor and close to your feet and get kicked around. So we decided that we should make a radius corner on the front 2 corners of this pedestal base. In order to do that, we'll actually use a template. The template is used for 2 things. First of all, to mark the radius so it's consistent on the 2 corners. And a little bit later, you'll see how the template comes in very handy for making a very smooth cut there. So in order to make this template, it'll start out square. I've gone to the art store, purchased a plastic template. I'm using a 3-inch radius here, and I'll just align it at the corner and draw my radius. Now with this radius drawn, the easiest way is probably just go to the bandsaw, rough cut this, staying just outside the line, then use a sanding block to sand it nice and smooth until I get exactly the radius that I want here on the corner, and that would look like this. Now I will use this template to first mark the radius at the corner. So I line the 2 edges, and then I just mark that same radius at the corner. Now, this piece is way too heavy to try and manhandle over at the bandsaw, so instead, I'll use a jigsaw. Use a jigsaw to cut well outside the layout line. We'll trim it up next. As you can see, I've rough cut this radius and I've stayed well outside the line here. Now how do I make this a nice smooth radius cut? Well, that's the second use for the template. We're going to bring it up, and in this case we'll use a router with a flush trim bit. This is a straight bit with a bearing on the end, and the way this works is, in this case, the template will be mounted to the underside of our workpiece, and then the router bit, the flush trim bit, will ride along, the bearing will ride along the edge of the template and make a nice smooth cut on our radius. Now the question is, how do I mount the template to the bottom of this workpiece? Well, clamps would get in the way, so we're going to switch instead to our old friend, double-sided tape. I'll just peel this off and then bring it to the underside, align the edges of the template with the edges of the base, and press it in place. Bring the bearing up against the edge of the template and route the radius. You can see how the flush trim bit makes a nice smooth radius here at the corner of our pedestal base. Now you may be asking, why do you go through all this effort to use a template and a flush trim bit just to make a corner on this base? Well, it's actually a technique that we'll use several more times to build this router table, so it's a good thing to get a little practice in on the base. Now there is one last step. This base is going to be on the floor, as we mentioned, and this top corner is going to be subject also to getting kicked and chipping out. So we thought we would round over that top corner on 3 edges. Now to do that, we'll use a round over bit with a bearing, and the bearing will guide the router bit to make a nice round over, which will complete our pedestal base. Turn on the router, bring the bearing up to the edge, and route the round over. I've just finished making a test cut in a piece of scrap. So let's take a look here. This is a test cut for the joinery that we're going to use, the cabinet for the base of our router table. So that cabinet starts out with 5 basic pieces. We'll have 2 sides, a top, a bottom, and a shelf. Now later we'll add a back to this, but we can't cut the back yet until we cut these first 5 pieces to final size. Now that all starts out as one big sheet of MDF material that we have to cut down to size. I typically use a circular saw to cut it down, a little bit oversized, about 1/2 inch bigger in both width and length. And then I bring those pieces over here to the table saw and then cut them down to final size. Now in this case, on this project, all 5 pieces can be cut to final size right at the beginning. Now once they're cut, then we'll join them together. And in this case, we'll use rabbets and dados in order to make that joinery. So to make those joints, I've mounted a dado set in the table saw, and I've adjusted the width of this to meet the thickness of the material, the MDF that I'm using. Now that thickness should be so that when I cut a test groove in here and bring up another test piece and fit it in, I get a nice friction fit. Now by friction fit, I mean that I don't have to pound it in with a hammer. It'll slide in, but it's not so loose that it just falls off. It actually fits so that I could even pick this piece up. That'll produce a very good glue joint for all of my project here. Now in order to get this groove and the dados to the exact width that I need to do a little bit of fiddling around here with the dado set. I've got my 2 outside blades and then a series of chippers in between. And to dial that in, I'll add some shims in between. These are very thin little discs that go in between the chippers, and that'll widen out the width of my dado set until I can dial it in and get the exact width to fit the MDF material that I'm working with. Now once that's done, I can start making the joinery. The first joint that I'm going to do is cut a rabbet along the bottom edge of the side pieces and also along the back edge. Now to do that, I'll actually add an auxiliary fence to my rip fence so that I can move this all over and snug it up right next to the blade. So let me get that done and we'll start working on the joinery. Now I can make a rabbet cut along the bottom edge of the side pieces, flip it around and make another rabbet cut along the back edge of the side pieces. After cutting the rabbets on the bottom edge and the back edge of the side pieces, while I still had that same setup on the saw, I went ahead and cut the same rabbets along the back edge of the bottom piece and the top piece. Now that'll fit, the back will fit in between these 2 pieces, so I need these rabbets. So all of those rabbets are the same size. Now before I change the setting on the saw, I just like to make one last check just to make sure that I bring up a scrap piece here and this rabbet is nice and flush along the back edge. So now I'm ready to make the next set of cuts. And that will be a set of dados that go across for the shelf and the top. Now that's over here, so I need the shelf and the top to fit in the side pieces. And I've adjusted my fence for that first cut so it's the right distance from the bottom of the side piece, this bottom rabbet, up to this first dado for the shelf. And I'll flip the piece over, push the bottom edge of the side piece against the fence, and make the cut. Well, I use the same setup and procedure to cut another dado, and that's for this top to fit into the side piece. Now, while I was at it, I went ahead and cut 4 more dados, and this is on the top side of the top piece. There's 2 on each side, and these dados are used to mount these dividers, which we'll do a little bit later, but I went ahead and cut them with this same procedure here at the table saw. Now, with that all done, there's just one more step on the side pieces, and that is to drill a couple of holes. Now, these holes, one of them is for a locking mechanism, and one is for the pivot pin, so this top can pivot down and then lock in place. So I have to drill these 2 holes in both side pieces, and I'll start by drilling the holes for this locking mechanism near the back of the side pieces. So I'll bring up both pieces to the drill press, and since they're kind of heavy and long, I've added an outrigger here. Now, the easiest way to drill the hole that's perfectly aligned in both pieces is to drill them in both pieces at the same time. So to do that, I'm actually setting up with a fence here and a stop block to register both pieces, and I'll slide them right into place, make sure that they're perfectly aligned, and when they are aligned, I can turn on the drill press and drill the holes. So I've drilled the first set of holes in both pieces. Now I have to drill another set of holes, and that's for the pivot pin. Now I use the same procedure where the pieces are stacked on top of each other. I have an outrigger to support them, and then I'm going to slide them up so that they're registered against the fence and the stop block, and both perfectly aligned, and then I can drill the hole. I've drilled the pivot holes in exactly the same position on both side pieces. Now, there's a reason why I wanted to do this second, and that is to leave the fence and the stop block exactly where they were. So the procedure is to go ahead and assemble the bottom part of the cabinet. Then later we'll add this divider section up top. That supports all this tilting mechanism. But we also need another set of holes for pivot pins in the dividers. And if I leave this all set up, I can drill those holes in the dividers in exactly the same position. So for now, I'll just take all these pieces, head over to the bench, and start assembling.